Okay, YouTube is working.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Yep, I can see us on YouTube.
Okay, we've got 1 minute before we start.
Okay, great. Yep, I can see us on YouTube. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all first for joining us tonight for our second October 2020 preservation conversation, Albert Pike, the Man in the Scottish Rite Temple, presented by our friend Maureen Richmond. I am Patricia Blick, the Executive Director of the QQA, and I am joined by Shelley Stormo, QQA Membership and Activities Coordinator. I would like to acknowledge the Quapaw Nation. They have generously underwritten this year's Preservation Conversation series. We would also like to thank our corporate and individual members. We would not be able to carry out our mission without their support. You can find a list of our corporate members at our website, quapaw.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work that we do. Please go to quapaw.com to join or to make a donation. I'd also like to remind you that this program is worth 1 hour of AIA CEU credits. Please email us at qqa@quapaw.com to register your participation. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of this talk. Please type your questions in the chat or Q&A area of Zoom. We are also sharing this program on YouTube. I will monitor Zoom chat comments and questions, and Shelley will monitor YouTube questions. On to tonight's preservation conversation. I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Maureen Richmond. Maureen Richmond is a native Arkansan with a keen interest in the esoteric. Born in the southwestern corner of the state, but raised in Little Rock, Richmond graduated from Hall High School and the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. An enthusiast of composition, literature, and creative writing, Richmond earned a master's degree in English and creative writing from Southern New Hampshire University and entered the Arkansas State University doctoral program in Heritage Studies in 2018. Richmond is an independent scholar of the Western esoteric tradition, which includes the study of the Masonic tradition. She has a special interest in the writings of Albert Pike and his place within the international Masonic movement. Please join me in welcoming Maureen Richmond.
Thank you, Patricia. It's wonderful to be with everybody here today. Let's see, are we ready for share screen? We are. This evening we'll be speaking about the Albert Pike Heritage in Little Rock, Arkansas, roughly during the period 1830 to 1930, but actually the content of tonight's exploration begins before that earlier date and extends beyond the later date. Here's the building in Little Rock on Scott Street that starts our whole conversation. It's a familiar landmark in Little Rock, and anyone who's spent time in downtown Little Rock or walked around in that area, or maybe even grew up here, has seen this and been curious about it. It fronts on Scott Street and runs between 7th and 8th Streets for a half a block's depth. So it's an enormous structure. And the interesting thing about this building, well, there are a lot of interesting things about this building, but the one I want to start with is the name of it, which is chiseled in right here on the frieze. But it's a little bit difficult to read. Up here at the title of this slide is the full name of the building, the Albert Pike Memorial Temple of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. One doesn't see that when one is walking at street level here, and it's hard even to glimpse up and angle your head back and glimpse up and get the whole name down. So we rarely see it. We just see this impressive facade here with the 19 columns, classical Greek columns of Ionic style in limestone, and it's so impressive. And at street level, it just looks like a federal building. But it's not a federal building, it's something much more. The name of this building is going to guide our discussion tonight, because when we look at this building, first thing we wonder about is, well, who's really Albert Pike if we don't know? What is the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, and what is Freemasonry? So I'll attempt to answer all those questions as we go on our journey this evening. What I'd like to do is to take you by the hand digitally and bring you along with my own journey of exploration about the meaning of this building. In so doing, we're going to look at the outside of the building, the inside of the building, and some other visible landmarks here in Little Rock that have to do with the legacy of Albert Pike. And we're also going to look into the deep history of Masonry and what it's all about, so that we can understand the name of this building. Here's the way the building was pictured and conceptualized in the 1950s. It's just a postcard. You can see that basically they're the same configuration that we just saw. And a more recent photograph. This one is by me, standing on the 8th Street corner, looking down towards 7th Street. And you, in this photograph, can get a sense of the imposing nature of those columns. Right here, the center of the lower right, you see the two prominent figures that guard the entrance to this building. These are the two double-headed eagles, emblems of the Scottish Rite. The building itself has these features, and you can find out more about the name and the construction details at this website right here, and I'll talk about it more. That's the Scottish Rite website. Now, this building was constructed serially from some pre-existing structures between 1901 and 1956, but the bulk of it was remodeled and dedicated in 1924. It's in a neoclassical revival style with the columns that I mentioned. It has 3 floors, including a very substantive auditorium on the 2nd floor. It's made of Bedford limestone, and it has a cornerstone made of Batesville marble. Here's a close-up of the double-headed eagle, the symbol of the Scottish Rite. And even closer. And you can see how dramatic these sculptures are at street level and up close. I think they stand about 4.5 or 5 feet tall, and they're up on pedestals. So they really do command the environment. Here's a view of the building from the south side of the building along 8th Street. And you can see this has an abbreviated name of the building, the Albert Pike Memorial Temple. And again, the double-headed golden eagle, the symbol of the Scottish Rite. This one's a little harder to see. It's in shadow, but there it is. And this one up here is very clear to see. This is a theme that we'll see repeated throughout much of the symbolism related to the temple. The building is, of course, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, on which it was inscribed in 1986. Let's look a little bit at the story of Albert Pike. You know, he's not a native Arkansan. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1809 and passed away in the Washington, D.C. area in 1891. His life pretty much almost bookends the 19th century as a result, 1809 to 1891. He got the bulk of it there. He was born to an artisan father and a well-educated mother. And what's interesting about Albert Pike's youth is that he was intellectually precocious at a very young age. And on his own, he developed a facility in math and classical languages, specifically Greek. He used those skills to obtain an early acceptance to Harvard. The costs were too high, and so he didn't fulfill that objective, and which was a considerable dream for him, but he had this love of learning and classicism that you'll see repeated throughout his life and carried through into his Masonic endeavors. At the time that Albert Pike experienced his disappointment about Harvard, the United States was experiencing a massive westward expansion, and that whole genre of thinking, that whole mythos grabbed a hold of the young Albert Pike, and he decided to go search for his fortunes somewhere west. And west meant down through New York, and then down through Ohio, and then down into Tennessee, and ultimately to St. Louis, which was the jumping off point for all the westward expeditions. He attached himself to a hunting party that would end up in what is now New Mexico. And this, of course, was all travel accomplished by horseback and foot, walking a very long and arduous journey. But he made it as far as Santa Fe and Dallas, New Mexico, and spent some time out in that area, living a very rough life, survival existence in the wild, trapping and hunting and trading, and interacting with the Comanche and other Indian tribes that were in the western, what is now the western United States. Ultimately, he decided that this was no life for a scholarly type. The entire time he'd been writing poetry. Over the course of his life, he got quite a lot of poetry published and published some of it himself. So he'd been writing poetry and was very much still involved with the literary existence, and there was nothing like that for him in the Western wild. So he decided to come on back, and he was just in his 20s. This was in the early 1930s, 1830s. So with a few people from the original hunting party that he was in, he made his way back to the middle of what is now the United States. He thought he was going to New Orleans, which was a very cash-heavy place at that time, filled with all kinds of cultural stimulation and multinationality, and he thought he would really get on well there. On the way, though, the party came to what is the edge of now Arkansas, and they lost their way. there were no markings on the trails, and they didn't know really for sure which way to go. And instead of turning the proper direction to go farther south to New Orleans, they accidentally turned deeper east and came into Arkansas, landing around in the Van Buren, Fort Smith area. And at that point, they had been so long on the road, and Albert Pike was in such difficult conditions that he just decided to stop and teach school on the basis of what he knew. And so he did for a while, but from that location, he started communicating with two newspapers that were in the little village of Little Rock, Arkansas at that point. Well, there wasn't a state yet, so it was Little Rock. 600 people lived in this little village, and there were two newspapers here. He began to send political commentary and I believe some of his poetry to the editors. One of them became very fascinated, immediately offered him a job, and Albert Pike jumped at it. That's how he came to Little Rock. So he was a very young man when he did. A little bit younger than this picture. This would probably be him when he was in his 30s and 40s. He established himself as a newspaper writer and then editor and then owner. And at the same time began to read law, taught himself law, and became a member of the appropriate bar at that time and became a practicing attorney. He was a circuit riding attorney for 10 years in Arkansas, riding all over the state on horseback to serve his legal clients, some of whom were Indian tribes during this and a later period. And during this same period of time, he got an appointment to the equivalent of the state Supreme Court then, and that had a little salary. So he had three forms of income. It was newspapering, law, and court clerking. On that basis, he managed to accumulate a bit of a fortune and get married. This is him a little bit later in his life, probably in his 40s or 50s. And Albert Pike would stay in Little Rock for the most of the next 30 years. He was briefly in New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, but Little Rock most of the time. This is him in later life, also much later life, toward the end of his life, and would have been taken in Washington, D.C., most likely, or Alexandria. Here's a bust of Albert Pike, which stands inside the temple that we're learning about tonight. And here you can see it in its niche there. This is the home that he was able to build for his wife and emerging family, growing family. This was constructed, this is the Pike Mansion, which today is, of course, called the Pike Fletcher Terry Mansion, and it's used by the Arkansas Arts Center for various things today. But this was originally the homestead of the Pike family. You can see it's in classical revival style with the 6 columns across. It was designed by Albert Pike. The entryway, there, see the columns again. The entryway, which is shown here a little bit incorrectly because there was some parallax. These are actually parallel. These sidelights are actually parallel. Perhaps is reminiscent of an Egyptian temple, and we'll see why in just a moment. Here's the inside of the now extant Masonic temple on Scott Street, and you can see the similarity of the decorative and architectural themes, the columns, and this shape represented again inside one of the ritual chambers, of which there are many in that large building. This is one of what's called the Blue Lodge, and you're looking at the master's area in the east with a lot of Masonic symbolism attached here. Here's another view of that very same thing. And we'll come back to symbolisms that you see here, such as the 3 lights, the insignia here. And again, you see this Egyptian temple-like formation. Inside the Albert Pike Memorial Temple, there are all kinds of large rooms. This is the dining room, and I believe this is either a colorized photograph or an artist's rendition. You can see the ornate nature of the interior embellishment. Back here, the focal point is quite a bit of stained glass, which is very intricate. And then there is the ornate tray ceiling. It's quite an impressive environment. The second floor auditorium is designed in the round with a couple of special embellishments and featuring again the double-headed golden eagle of the Scottish Rite. And this is where the large gatherings of Masons would occur for the purpose of the holding the initiatory degree rituals. And those rituals would occur right here on this stage while viewed by hundreds and hundreds. I think the seating is 740 some odd. Here's another view of that same space with the scene setting for a particular degree working. There are 32 of those in the Scottish Rite, and each one of them represents a philosophical lesson or a morality play that is actually enacted by characters in costume. Some of those degree workings are historical in nature, some are mythological. They're all highly symbolic and teach a lesson about character and responsibility, big themes in Masonic philosophy. More views of these backdrops. These were hand-painted on canvas by a famous American landscape painter in the 1920s when this building was largely redesigned. They're still there. There are over 100 of them, different types of scenery, such as this of the Middle Eastern temple environment, definitely Egyptian. Renaissance, perhaps, and the room of the costumes. This is where they store the various ritual. Well, these are really costumes for the degree workings. These are not ritual wear. These are for the dramatic presentations that would occur on the stage there in the auditorium. This particular photograph comes from the Scottish Rite website. I did not take this, but I have been inside of a ritual or a costume room in another Masonic lodge that was very similar. This is a blurry photograph, pardon me, I took it, of some of the interior stained glass to be seen inside. That's a view of a ceiling, false floor above with some lighting in it. And so this is something that you look at up above your head in one of the hallways. More beautiful stained glass sits in this special area that's, I believe, called the Templar Chapel, Templar. And we're going to get to a discussion of what that means. It's got to do with the Knights Templar. We'll see what relationship that has with Masonry, according to historical research, which might differ a little bit from the oral histories told within the Masonic tradition itself. But this is right inside the Albert Pike Memorial Temple on Scott Street, and it has a very beautiful atmosphere inside, and this stained glass is quite intricate. Here's a close-up. It's like the theme of St. Michael with the dragon, doesn't it? This place is a real historic treasure. Also inside the Templar Chapel is this door. This is leading out. If you push through there, you'd be in some of the interior halls of the second floor of the temple, of the memorial. very blurry. Pardon me for this. This is one of the many composite photographs to be found along the passageways and halls on the second floor inside the temple. And I kept it even though it was so terribly blurry, because you can see here's Pike right here, and brethren throughout the years. And there are many such along the halls, really lining the halls, so that so much Masonic history of Arkansas Masonry is recorded in various ways right here in this temple. On the first floor, these 5 portraits are displayed proudly, and they're all gentlemen who were Masons in the, I believe in the 70s, 60s and 70s. Only these 3 names I can remember. I believe this is Sid McMath, who was one time governor of Arkansas, and I think he was also mayor of Little Rock at one point. This is John Paul Hammerschmidt, who was United States representative. And I believe this is Harold Gwatney, who was a major Little Rock businessman and the owner of Gwatney Chevrolet, which was a major car dealership in Little Rock for a very long time. Many of the Masonic leaders were also business and civic leaders over the decades in Little Rock. More visible history of the Pike legacy can be found at Mount Holly Cemetery, which is on Broadway in the downtown area of Little Rock. The cemetery is over this way. Downtown is here, obviously, and there's the freeway right in there. The cemetery is over this way, and we're going to go into that now because there's a plot here that contains the graves of many of Albert Pike's family members. He himself is not buried here, but many of his family members are. And why is that? It's because they were separated at the end of his life for a lot of reasons we'll get into as we go along. But his wife is buried here, and some of his children are buried here. This is on the sort of the southwest quadrant of Mount Holly grounds. Here's the photograph of his wife's headstone, Mary Hamilton Pike, wife of Albert Pike. And a headstone of note. This is the headstone for a Native American woman by the name of the English name of Quaty. I'm sure she had her own Native American name. This woman was a member of the Pike household for a number of years toward the end of her life. Her husband was a Cherokee chief, English named John Ross, who Albert Pike befriended, or John Ross befriended Albert Pike, whichever way you want to say it. They became great friends in the midst of all this terrible turmoil and Indian relocation that was commandeered by the United States government. Somehow Albert Pike managed to solidify meaningful friendship across that boundary. And this is one of the friendships that was developed during that time. Chief Ross asked Albert Pike to take Quaty, his wife, under his wing and take care of her should he pass first. And indeed, the chief did pass first, and Quaty then joined the Pike household and was there with them for many years in Little Rock at the mansion that you just saw before she passed away. And then she was interred at Mount Holly, but this headstone was added in 1935. And it's still there in Mount Holly, and it's visited by many people who revere this area and leave little tokens of interest and devotion there. In the same area, there are many Masonic graves that attest to the importance and vitality of the Masonic community in Little Rock. This is just one of the very ornate burial memorials. And here's another one of Fay Hempstead, who was a central leader within the Masonic community from the late 1800s through 1930s. And you can see here all his titles, including Grand Commandery of the Knights Templar. There are lots of Masonic symbols and insignia on headstones in Mount Holly. This is just one. It's the back of the headstone, and you wouldn't see it if you didn't go around and have a look at it, but there it is, and there you have the Masonic compass and square, and the Masonic symbol of fraternity, the handshake. So what is the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Freemasonry, or Scottish Rite of Freemasonry? We know this is its symbol, and it's shown in various ways in different contexts, sometime with the 32 degrees, sometime with the number 33, indicating the honorary degree which caps Scottish Rite. They all refer to the Scottish Rite. And you can see that the outline and the symbology is very similar in every case. For a long time, mainstream history recorded the beginning of Masonry as the year 1717, when a group of gentlemen met at a pub or an inn in England and did what they considered to be the convening of a grand lodge of Masons. And for a long time, it was thought that it just came out of nowhere. Somebody had an idea. But since 1990, more research has been done. David Stevenson is a historian of Scotland who's held many distinguished academic positions. This is one of his books, The First Freemasons, Scotland's Early Lodges and Their Members. Stevenson did something nobody had ever done to that point for some reason. He dug into public history records that were held in Scotland that detailed all the meetings and the membership and the beliefs and rituals of the earliest record of anything that could be like this, stonemasonry. And here's what he concluded. Freemasonry, he said, began in Scotland in the early 1600s with the stoneworking guilds. The word Freemasonry referred to those individuals, men who were free to move about from one city to another and to ply their crafts. Not everyone was. There was a very strict system that governed employment and who could practice different skills and crafts and arts in this period. Only certain ones had the freedom to move about. The rituals that were used, the whole method of organization in these early stoneworking guilds in Scotland seemed to be the origin of the architectural metaphor that is used in masonry, including the building tools as symbols of aspects of character. So Stevenson says Masonry as it appeared in London in 1717 was definitely derived from the earlier Scottish Freemasonry. To this day, craft masonry bears clear evidence of its Scottish origins. And stonemason guilds of the Scottish medieval period were similar to other guilds, except for this one important difference. They embraced sweeping mythic accounts of their origins and identified the roots of architecture and geometry. And these are themes that will carry through Albert Pike's day and beyond. A second book by Stevenson is The Origins of Freemasonry. He says the same thing there, based on essentially the same research. And here's the kind of world that would have been in. It had to do with the building of cathedrals and public structures that were made of stone, the necessity of cutting and shaping stones, measuring, establishing a level, a true line, and all of this was thought to be a metaphor for, in some cases, the work of the divine creator. Looks like somebody raised a hand, George Campbell. Are we taking questions at this point? No. Okay, George, will you bookmark that thought, and we will come back to it. Thank you for your question. Here's another illustration from the period that seems that really speaks of the notion of quarrying, stone quarrying, and working with stones, shaping them, and the whole labor of constructing buildings in that period. This is a stonework representation of one of the builders or the masons of the time, stone masons of the time, and you could see him with his square there. That's really important. It becomes part of the Masonic symbol, this right angle thing. So this is the compass and the square of the Masonic insignia. With the letter G here, it symbolizes any number of things. Obviously, you could make the case for it. It's the first letter of the word God. So it's the seventh letter of the English alphabet. But that's another story. We'll come to that at another time. Here's another more elaborate depiction of the same thing with the two columns included, a critical part of Masonic symbolism. There it is. There you see it manifested in the Blue Lodge, right here in the temple in Little Rock, and in many other Masonic ritual chambers everywhere, all over the world. Here's that same insignia. Now you can see there's the square and the compass. There's a body of literature that says that the roots of Masonry go much farther back to the Knights Templar in the 1112 and 1300s in medieval Europe. The Templars were originally a monastic order chartered by the Catholic Church, and this would have been the only church that there was at that time because it was long before the Protestant Reformation. Their charge was to protect Christian travelers in the Holy Land so that they could get to Jerusalem. And it was their understanding that what their objective was concerned the Temple of Solomon and getting back to the Temple of Solomon to protect it or even build it. And the notion of the Temple of Solomon became a central metaphor for doing the divine or God's work in the world for the Templar organization. And that's a fascinating story, all the details of which we should not go into here because it'll take us 2 hours to get through it all. To suffice it to say that over time, this organization accumulated an enormous amount of power and influence in the world at that time, and that got them into some trouble because there came a day when the King of France wanted them out of his way for various reasons. And soon, well, this is a picture of them in battle. Soon came the Templar persecution when the very organization that had spawned it turned against it. Allegations of fraternizing with the Islamic enemy while they were in the Holy Land and integrating various teachings and principles that they could have easily picked up during that period of time. During that period of time, Europe was in the Dark Ages, but the Islamic civilization was vital in terms of learning and had embraced the classical literature of Greece and Rome, and they were involved in translating it and looking at geometry and all kinds of classical science and astrology and all kinds of things. So that's what there would have been to talk about when one was visiting in their part of the world. And their cultural structure at that time in the Islamic world was diverse and tolerant. So communication across cultural lines was allowed. In the persecution of the Templars, it was a really disturbing chapter in European history. Just horrible things happened, all kinds of torture and everything. And the Templar order was pretty big at that point. Templars fled in every direction. Many went to Portugal and Scotland, where the authority of the Catholic Church did not reach at that time. So Scotland, that's where the Templars went. And they stayed up there for a long time with basically some of the same symbolisms and ideas that would emerge later in the stonemason guilds of Scotland and then migrate into just, across the border from Scotland into England into London. From there, it's an amazing story. Masonry grew very popular very quickly and to spread all over continental Europe. This is a picture of a French Masonic initiatory scene. You can see here the three lights, just like you saw the three lights in the Blue Lodge and the Little Rock Temple. There's a floor mat with all kinds of symbols on it that are used to usher or move a candidate through certain experiences. More depiction of the same. Here's someone with a hoodwink on or a blindfold. That's a part of the first degree in the Blue Lodge, the entered apprentice. And it has a symbolic meaning. More initiatory trials. This looks like it's also French Masonry in the 1700s. Some of these productions became very elaborate and a little bit too realistic. More of the same. And Masons eventually rose to tremendous prominence in the major cities in Europe and in the colonies, the English colonies in North America. American historian Margaret Jacob even argues in her Living the Enlightenment that it was the Masonic lodges in Paris that served as the incubation zones for the French Revolution and its driving ideal of liberty, equality, and fraternity, based on ideas of freedom and self-governance and justice that are found in the Masonic Code. Certainly, the Masonic philosophy was very powerful and prominent in the founding of the United States. George Washington was a practicing Mason, as was Ben Franklin and some others. Here you see him laying a cornerstone, which is one of the major activities that early Masons in America were involved with. A lot of the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. went through that process. There's a wonderful video at this website at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, that will tune you in to all of that process. GWmemorial.org. That'll get you there. And here's George Washington again, depicted in his Masonic regalia with the trowel, which is one of the tools of stonemasonry, and has a symbolic meaning in speculative masonry. Operative masonry was the real building trade. Speculative is the philosophical component of the Masonic path. Stephen C. Bullock is an American historian, well respected. He published, I believe, this book through UNC Press, if I remember correctly, University of North Carolina Press. And he took a detailed look at the role of Freemasonry in the American social order from before the American Revolution until substantively after it. This is a fascinating book, well worth reading. It basically shows that the Masonic order functioned as a primary social club in the original 13 colonies, and almost as an adjunct of the federal government up to a point. That changed in about 1820. Certain scandals developed and public opinion turned against the Masonic order, and it almost went out of existence. Who came to the rescue? Albert Pike. He was initiated in 1850, just a little bit after this period of time, into the Blue Lodge in Western Star Lodge in Little Rock, and then into Scottish Rite Masonry in South Carolina under the tutelage of Albert Gallatin Mackey, who was a dominant Masonic scholar of that period. The Masonic tradition had entered the United States through 2 points: New England with the British troops and Charleston, South Carolina, also with British influence and some French influence. At any rate, that's where it was, and that's where Albert Pike went for his initiation. So he got a hold of the philosophy and the rituals and undertook a revision, ultimately rising to the key figure in what was to become the revival of the Scottish Rite. Bullock says, in the 1860s, it was under the direction of Albert Pike that the sublime degrees blossomed into a genuinely popular Scottish Rite. And this is the word right here, popular, because it was this thrust that would repopularize the Masonic path for another nearly 100 years. Another study by Mark Carnes called The Secret Ritual of Manhood in Victorian America puts this development into a different context and tells us some things about the 1800s that we just would not know. It was a period of time in which all kinds of male fraternities and social clubs, such as Odd Fellows and the Masons, got their start. And it was a very common feature of that period of time. It's not so much now. So we're not really in touch with that, and we don't really realize how critical a part it played in the social, economic, and commercial networks of the 1800s. After studying that period of time, Carnes says in his late 1980 study that Albert Pike was the foremost 19th century Masonic ritualist. By the end of the 19th century, Pike's revision of the Scottish Rite rituals had become the standard for ritualistic excellence. The fact is, Albert Pike is known all over the world in Masonic circles, primarily for this book, Morals and Dogma, which was copyrighted in 1871 and first published in 1872. Here's the full title: Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And you can see that's the same as a piece of the name of the building. This is where a lot of the inspiration for the building is coming from. This book right here contains primarily deep reflections on the mythological traditions of the ancient world: Egyptian, Chaldean, Babylonian, Sumerian, Greek, and Roman. And it reveals Albert Pike as a profound student of classical learning. Here's some of what Pike writes about in Morals and Dogma. In degree 24, which is titled Prince of the Tabernacle, Pike zeroes in on the Egyptian Osiris myth. It's a myth of death and rebirth as the fundamental pattern which in his estimation was disseminated throughout the classical world to become its core paradigm. He states in this chapter, the mysteries of Osiris, Isis, and Horus seem to have been the model of all other ceremonies of initiation subsequently established among the different peoples of the world. Ceremonies of initiation, that's what he was concerned with. within masonry. In the same degree material, Pike elaborates the resemblance and ceremonial between the observances established in honor of Osiris in Egypt and those in honor of Bacchus in Greece, the mythological traditions of these two gods, and the symbols used in the festivals of each amply prove their identity. So you can see here the kind of thinking that was native to Albert Pike. And what you don't see here is that Albert Pike was present in Little Rock, Arkansas in the years that ran up to the Civil War. And what you don't see here is that Albert Pike argued for statehood for Arkansas in the early 1830s, at a time when statehood meant of necessity that Arkansas would be a slaveholding state. And what you don't see here, and which is a problem for a lot of people, is that Albert Pike in his 50s, when he was not combat ready, was taken into the Confederate Army as a brigadier general, and his primary responsibility was to liaison with Indian tribes because he could speak to them in their own languages. But he was still a member of the Confederate Army. It was only about for a couple of years. He got in a big argument with them and with the Confederate leadership because of their treatment of Native Americans, and left the Confederacy, but he was still in for a couple of years. In the end, he had to, when he quit that or resigned his commission, he was then in trouble with the Confederacy as well as with the Union for having been part of the Confederacy. So he had to run, and he ended up in the wilderness in the western part of the state. It was during that period that that historians feel that he did a great deal of his thinking and the preliminary parts of his writing for Morals and Dogma. So it's a pretty amazing story. Back to Little Rock. These are some of the prior incarnations of the Albert Pike Memorial Temple, starting back in the late 1890s. This was a building called the Albert Pike Cathedral. It was at 3rd and Center Street. The membership grew so much that the buildings went through several different iterations to get down to the property at 7th and Scott that runs to 8th and Scott. Close up of one of those. The ArkansasScottishRite.org is a great site to go to learn more. You learned there that the building was designed by architects Mann and Stern. Mann was considered the dean of Arkansas architects, doing the Arkansas State Capitol and the Arlington Hotel in Hot Springs. Additional resources can be found at the Arkansas State Archives, where there are some handwritten letters of Pike's that were sent from the Washington, D.C. area to the Little Rock area after the Civil War, when Pike was communicating with people that knew him in Little Rock. The Butler Center has some resources, the Albert Pike Masonic Center quite a bit. I have a scholarly literature review which can be requested by email. It reviews several history-based resources in academia that relate to the Albert Pike story. And there's a great video out there by the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program and their Sandwiching in History program, and took place in the year 2015. Also at the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program website, you can see the nomination form for the National Register of Historic Places for the temple. And from time to time, the Pulaski County Historical Review publishes articles that touch on the Pike legacy. As a matter of fact, they did so very recently and answered a question about what had happened to the library of Albert Pike that was once held in the Pike home at the Pike Mansion before the Civil War. Now that's a very interesting story. The story reveals that Pike spent a good bit of time in the southwest corner of the state. down around Camden and Washington, Arkansas. That was the area in which the Confederate capital of Arkansas moved at one point when Union forces had come in to the north and central part of the state. So there's a piece of the Pike legacy that connects there, and some of his library was hidden in that area before it was toward the end of his life sent to him in Washington, D.C. And that's a big point of interest for anyone who reads his several works, because everyone wants to see what he was reading and what he was thinking that sparked the type of scholarly work that he did. Thank you so much. I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Maureen. I am someone who's obviously enamored of that beautiful building, so I appreciate any opportunity that you get to see some of those spaces, especially those that are not as easily accessed or as accessible. We are going to we have a time for a few questions. I don't know if Mr. Campbell is still on here, wants to ask a question, but we do have one from Shannon Cardiac. She said, please repeat the name of the author who wrote the 2 books about the early Masons. And she wrote Stevenson. Was that the name?
David Stevenson. And he has 2 studies, so I believe that's him, just one author, David Stevenson, Stevenson, Scottish historian.
Question from Bill Wells. Thank you. I put it in the comments just so everyone can see that too. Any information on how the temple was sited in relation to the First Presbyterian? I'm guessing you meant First Presbyterian Church. Do you recall?
I haven't really read anything about that. Is he asking which one was there first?
I don't know. I'm not sure, Bill, if you want to elaborate. Is your question about location proximity or just in, he wrote the Boys Club real estate development.
That's not been an area that I've looked into. Sorry, I don't know anything about that.
Okay, Bill, we'll try to see if we can dig something up about that. Becca Green is asking a question as well. It makes a statement. I managed a photo shoot at the temple in 2005 and was told by the building guide that the theater lighting system was the same as that of the New York Metropolitan Opera. It was amazing. Well, that's quite impressive. A question from Terry Hunkapiller. George Mann, where is he from?
You're one of the architects?
Uh-huh.
I don't know that either. Sorry.
We can probably help you with that, Terry. We have a great resources, Architects of Arkansas. So we'll take a look at that and see if we can put some source material in when we follow up. Shelley, did you have any questions on YouTube?
I want to go back to that question about the stage system, the lighting and the curtains and the pulleys and cables and all that stuff. Yeah, that is the original system from 1924, the original lighting system.
Okay.
I have an answer to the George Mann question.
Oh, good.
He was born in Indiana. And also, I do not have any questions on YouTube.
Okay. I'm going to let George Campbell talk. George, do you want to talk? Let's see. Because George has raised his hand. George, you're either going to have to unmute yourself or you will need to type in your question because let's see. I cannot do it at this end, so you'll need to unmute. TJ, let me see. We have another question from TJ Henwood. You raised your hand as well. Would you like to? Hey,
TJ. Hey, TJ Henwood. You're the source of a lot of this information.
Well, that was mostly what I wanted to just say was thank you so much for all of the scholarly research and work that you have done on our beautiful temple. And I've enjoyed watching your webinar tonight. I just wanted to let you know I'm here.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us.
TJ was a tremendous help to me when I started out this study. And none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for TJ. He opened the door, made it possible. I could just go on for a very long time about that and would love to.
Lovely. Thank you. And thank you. I would say too, to temple for allowing, the public access to the building, because I know that hasn't always been the case. So it's, I think, greatly appreciated by people who can have events there and programs and what have you. So it is quite a lovely resource. Wilson Stiles, former state preservation officer, had a question. Do you think the recent criticism of Pike and the toppling of his statue in Washington is justified?
Okay, I'll stick my neck out. I would say it's not nuanced. It's a one-dimensional response to what has happened. I think Pike was very much a man of his time, and we all know what the issues were in the Civil War, and we all know that we're not for slavery. So there's no question about that. Whether Pike was for slavery is up in the air. I've never found anything in any of his writing that suggests that he would approve of that. And yet there he was in the midst of the situation, arguing for statehood, and also he also argued for the legitimacy of the states' rights position, as well as I remember. So I think it's a circumstance where we need to just label it and say what it is, but not tear it down. Give some history.
Yeah.
Yes, give some history.
Thank you for addressing it. I mean, it is, it's something that we are definitely grappling with. I appreciate that. Thank you, Wilson, for asking that question. Just a follow up from Terry Hunkapiller. Great. Thanks so much. My great grandfather was George Washington Mann. Thank you. I have another path to pursue. So very nice. Jared Atkinson filled us in with a little more information. The Boys Club was a block south on the site of the former home of William Gilchrist, who was the first Grand Master of Arkansas. So obviously in close proximity. So interesting there. Bill Wells, the building, the technology of that time that goes from the impact of spiritualist understanding of architecture that emerged. He asked that as a question, but it's almost kind of a statement. And then Bill had another question. Does the temple collect artifacts? Do you know? Or I guess maybe we can ask TJ if he wants to say, do you all
I think you should ask TJ, yeah.
If you all accept artifacts, or if you're inundated with a lot of artifacts that you can't maybe curate or what have you. So they might have a curation policy or a accession policy. I can't seem to get him to unmute. So let's see. We'll have to see. We'll have to look into that. That's another one we'll have to dig into a little bit more. Okay, I think I've gotten through all of the questions that we could answer, at least easily. Some of them obviously need a little bit more information. Unless we can find out from TJ if the artifacts are collected. So I think he's not unmuted. So anyway, well, let me, I was going to ask Maureen as well a little bit about her heritage studies at ASU, and we talked a little bit as we were getting ready for the meeting tonight about how far along she is in her programs and is still working through some of her coursework in her start the dissertation here shortly. So if you want to give an update on that.
Probably many of you know that Arkansas State University in Jonesboro has a PhD program called Heritage Studies. I entered it in the fall of 2018. So goodness, it's been 2 years. During that period of time. Yes.
Oh, TJ is on with us. TJ, a question came up about artifacts. Does the temple collect artifacts associated with the site? And then Bill Wells had a follow along that his grandfather would contribute to the Masons around 1920. And he had some other comments in there. If you could take a look at that chat.
I'm not really sure. Well, I have not looked at the chat. I'm not sure about collecting of artifacts that have to do with the building itself. We have many of what I would call Masonic artifacts in terms of things that apply to the Masonic fraternity that have been donated over the years. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
He had sort of a little more in-depth curiosity about some he just said, does the temple collect artifacts? And my grandfather would contribute to the Masons around 1920. But when you look at design, connection to the divine, Zoroastrian belief systems, then how does the leadership knowledge lead a community forward? So a little more complicated, I think, than we can get into tonight as we're wrapping everything up. But appreciate the thought-provoking question. Jared Atkinson replied, though. He said there is a new museum within the temple for the Scottish Rite, and the Grand Lodge has a museum upstairs.
That's true.
So there are artifacts there, but I think Bill Wells was even asking a more philosophical question as well. But Maureen, do you want to just finish up with your thank you, TJ, about your PhD program?
Sure.
And then I just have a few little comments to close us up.
Heritage Studies is composed of historic preservation, folklore, museum, and archive studies. It's a multidisciplinary approach to basically to history. So that's what we do. It's right there for anybody who's interested. Just look it up online. It's a very rigorous program. And it's been a wonderful time of discovery about historic resources and assets all over the world, but also including here in Arkansas, and including right there at the Albert Pike Memorial Temple. That was one of my first projects that I did, and I'm so glad that I did it. And again, TJ Henwick helped me tremendously in putting together an interview segment of a study of the temple and all that it symbolizes.
Very nice. Very nice. We absolutely know and work with people who have pursued degrees in that program and feel very, robust in the training and the education that they got. All right, I think we're going to close down our questions and chats, and I'm just going to give you guys a couple little reminders as we're wrapping it up tonight. We have one preservation coming up in November, Thursday, November the 12th at 6 p.m., and it's going to be Brent Staley, and the title of the program is Historic Properties and Electrical. The risk is in what you cannot see. And again, it will be on Zoom and YouTube Live. We had initially planned a second November program from one of the ones we had to cancel this summer, but our speaker really wants to do it in person. So we're going to do that next year when hopefully we can meet in person again. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that our annual membership meeting is coming up on the 4th of November. So 2 weeks from yesterday is when that will be taking place. And it's going to be also virtual. Unfortunately, we just can't have large groups of folks together. And the invitations went out earlier this week. So all of our members should have gotten that in the mail. And if you didn't, get in touch with us, let me or Shelly know, and we can get your membership renewed or activated or what have you, and you can participate. And again, thank you all very much for coming. We hope that we'll see many of you at the annual membership meeting next month and in 2 weeks. And if not, we'll hopefully see you at the November preservation conversation. And I'll just note in here, if you're on the chat, Bill, TJ suggests taking a look at the Scottish Rite sites and the website sherwoodmasons.org. So that will be in our saved presentation, which will be available on YouTube as well. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. It was great to see everyone, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you very much, Maureen. Learned a lot, as always. Take care. Take care, everybody.